We saw in part 2 that an address space can contain any number of endpoint declarations, and that the resolution in that space happens in declaration order. And we saw that each endpoint gets, when the resolution process is happening, each endpoint gets the chance to say whether or not they wish to resolve the request that's being resolved. And a space can have any number of endpoints in it, and so obviously we could keep extending this part 2 space and put our entire application in there with everything crammed into one huge monolithic lump, which is kind of how the web works. Every endpoint exists in one space, and there's just a single resolution mechanism. But what I want to show you in part 3 is that we can create relationships between spaces. We can have more than one space, and we can create relationships between spaces. So we see that the third root space in this resolution demo is called part 3, and its name is part 3 import. And what we see is that we've got another endpoint declared here, and this has got a tag called import, and we see that it's referring to the part 2 space. So what this space is doing is it's saying import the resources, the resolvable resources from this space into this space. So what does that mean? Let's explore. First of all, I'll just show you a diagram. What we have is an arrangement somewhat like this. We have an address space here. We have an endpoint declared in it that's an import. An import is effectively just like any other endpoint. It gets the chance to resolve requests, and if it's asked to resolve a request, it doesn't actually locally resolve it. It knows about the relationship to another space, so it hands the resolution request over to the space that it has a relationship to, and that space then gets a chance to ask its endpoints if it resolves. And so the import is a specialized endpoint, but it's still just an endpoint. So what I want to do is I'm going to go to the Space Explorer tool, and I want to look at the part 3 space. So let's look at its structure diagram, and we see the diagram shows us the part 3 import space, and we see that it's got an endpoint declared in it called the import endpoint, and we see there's an arrow pointing us to the part 2 address space with 2 endpoints, and that contains those 2 endpoints that we had in the previous demo, accessor 1 and accessor 2. So what we see is that this import declared in this space is providing a relationship between this space and this space, so that these endpoints over here effectively become usable over here. And if we go and look at the module details, the space details for import 3, what we see is something a little different to the previous part 2 example. We see the physical endpoint is called import, and it imports part 2. And then we see that the import actually provides us with 2 logical endpoints. So what it's doing is it's basically projecting into this space the 2 endpoints, A1 and A2, from the part 2 endpoint space. Notice that the space is delegated, so it's telling us that we can go and look at these. These are effectively images of the endpoints coming from this other space. So that shows us some detail. If I actually go and look at the logical endpoint details of that thing, logically it looks exactly the same. Physically it's routed to by a different route, but logically it's exactly the same resource. It's active colon 1. So we'd expect that if we make a request in this address space for active colon 1, active colon 2, it will behave similarly to the previous example. So let's go and probe the space, and we need the part 3 space. So what happens if I request active 1 with a source verb in the part 3 address space? So we see that it resolves, and it resolves to a physical instance of accessor 1, and we see that the logical ID was P2A1. So it actually resolved to the part 2 A1 instance. And we see now that there's more than one space in our scope. I'll get back to that in a moment. But we can look at the resolution trace, and we see that this time the resolution request started in part 3 import, and we see that it then entered an import, and the import was part 2 to 2 endpoints. And then we look at the resolution inside the part 2, and we see that it matched on accessor 1. So it resolved into this space that we've already used before, and we find that the resolution response is yes, the import is happy to receive that request because it knows the physical location of the endpoint that will be resolved. Again, if I ask for active 2 and resolve that, then I have accessor 2 resolved, and I find that again it's imported, it resolves in the same way. And notice that now we start in part 3 address space, we get delegated by the import into the part 2 address space. We first try the accessor 1 in part 2 address space, but it doesn't want it because it doesn't match its grammar, and then we find accessor 2 and it tries to resolve. So by putting an import relationship, a declaration in an address space, what we're doing is we're logically projecting into this address space at that point all of the public endpoints, all the public logical endpoints that are provided by this space. And if we ever issue a request for those endpoints, then the request will be resolved down into that space and executed in that space. So active 1 is executed here, active 2 is executed here. Logically they appear in this space.